Would you say that God has lived up to that promise so far? We've seen all kinds of things happen to Abraham and around Abraham, but the point of the narrative always comes back to God is taking care of Abraham. However, if you're Abraham and you can't read the rest of the book, does it seem to you that God is keeping all of his promises? That's where the problem comes in. Abraham is still a young man in his faith. He's still looking forward to some things that God has promised him, but he hasn't seen yet. And so as we start chapter 15, we look at a man who has received a whole lot of stuff from God, but the one thing in particular that perhaps defines their relationship the most has not showed up yet, and so he's concerned about that. In chapter 15 and chapter 16, we're going to see three ancient customs. Two of them are initiated by Abraham and or Sarah, initiated by men. Both times they're rejected. The other one is initiated by God, and it's really an odd ancient custom, but we're going to look at the two that occur in 15, and then, Lord willing, next week we'll take a look at the third one that's initiated by Sarah. But beginning in chapter 15, verse 1, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. After this refers back to the things that were going on in chapter 14, in which Abraham wins a great battle, is met by Melchizedek and gives Melchizedek a tenth of all the things that he has. And then in 15, don't be afraid. Don't get weary in well-doing. Don't give up on the promises that I've made to you, because I am your shield and I am your reward. Well, we've seen the shield part, right? He takes his 318 men and he goes after 5 kings and defeats them all and is able to rescue Lot. So God is his defense. God will bless those that bless him and curse those that curse him. But what about your very great reward? God is promising him things that he's not yet receiving, things that he does not yet see. So here's Abram's response. O sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. The word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. And then he took him outside and he said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And he said, so shall your offspring be. And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. The first of the oddities, the first strange ancient custom, is that if you did not have any children, you would adopt a servant. And typically it would be a servant that had been with you the longest. And Eliezer of Damascus was evidently the most long associated servant that Abraham had. Probably came with him from Haran. This was a custom among the people of Haran, that you would adopt one of your servants, and then everything that you had would get passed along to that servant. I don't know that we have anything in the modern era that would match it, unless you had a guy who owned a great corporation, and after all those years, he didn't have any children to leave the corporation to, so he left it to his CEO. Right? You pass it to somebody who's not part of the family. All of the belongings pass out of the family at that time and into the family of the servant. And God's immediate response is, Eliezer of Damascus is not going to be the one who inherits your things, but somebody from your own body. Your own heir from your own body is the one that will inherit these goods. Now, I want to just jump over a little bit to chapter 16. When Abram says, well, I'll just adopt Eliezer, and God says no, Sarah's second choice is, well, we'll have one out of your body, but not out of mine. right? So when we get to Hagar, it's the second stage, right? He's not out of our body at all. God says he'll be out of your body. So Abraham goes to Hagar. They have a child together. So that one's out of Abraham's body, but not out of Sarah's. That child is going to be rejected as well, right? So it's not going to be just Abram's body, but it's also going to be from Sarai's body. It reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about this morning with Nicodemus. You've got a culture that does things a certain way, and so when you start trying to get an understanding of God, you take God and try to fit him into your culture. The United States has had that kind of thing happen down through history. European countries have had that happen down through history. They get in their mind in advance who God is and what they expect God to do, and then they just try to fit him into the program. And sometimes God doesn't fit into those programs that we create for him. So shall your offspring be if you can count the stars in the heavens. He gets the sands of the seashore, right? If you can count the sand, you can count your offspring. He gets the stars. If you can count the stars of the heavens, then you can count the ones that will be your offspring. And Abraham, in spite of his misgivings, believes God, and it is given to him, it is credited to him as righteousness. This is one of the most important verses in all of Scripture. And it's just kind of stuck here in the middle of this passage about some weird ancient cultural thing where Abraham says, well, I'll have to leave it all to Eliezer. And God says, no, you won't. Look at all the stars. If you can count the stars, you can count your offspring. And at that moment, Abraham says, I believe that God's going to do what God says he's going to do. And so it is credited to him as righteousness. Paul picks up on this in Romans chapter 4. He spends chapters 1 through 3 making sure that we understand that everybody has sinned. Right? So you get to the end of chapter 3 verse 22, 23 right in there, and he says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Right? And then he starts talking about the salvation that comes through the sacrifice of Jesus, which is available to everybody, to Jews and to Gentiles, to locals and foreigners, right? He starts making that point. And in 4, he says, because Abraham believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness, aside from the law, right? Abraham lives some 400 years before the law at Sinai. So Paul is trying to make the point that Abraham was given righteousness prior to anything that Abraham did. It was a gift of God. It's a grace thing that Abraham was brought in this way. And he uses him as an example for the rest of humanity of coming to God, not trying to earn our way into righteousness, but accepting the righteousness that only comes through a relationship with Jesus. James picks up on it, and instead of connecting it to this particular situation, he connects it to the sacrifice of Isaac. Right? Was Abraham our father not counted as righteous when he sacrificed his son Isaac? So he has more of a component of what Abraham did in response to the faith that he had. But in this particular passage, what does Abraham do? Nothing. He just believes. He gives himself over to that idea that God can do what God said that he was going to do. So in verse 7, he also said to him, I am the Lord, the one who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So in verse 6, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. In verse 7, Abraham says, but. Right? So you see his infancy. You see his struggle. I realize that something's going on here that I can't see, that I can't experience physically. I haven't had a child. However, I believe that God's going to do something about it. But then the very next thing, the question is, how in the world are you going to pull this off? Because, I don't own this stuff. I don't own the land where I'm living. I'm the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land. Abraham says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and some young pigeons. Now, without going any farther, what's about to happen? There's going to be some sacrificing going on, right? There's got to be some reason that these animals are doomed. When God says, go get me a bunch of animals, it's not usually so we could put them in a pen and pet them and coo over them. So there's going to be some killing of these animals. But the Lord is very specific what he wants Abraham to bring to him. He wants 3-year-olds. He wants a heifer, a goat, and a ram. And he also wants a dove and some young pigeons. Right? So pretty much the whole gamut of animal sacrifices that we'll find later on. When the Israelites are at Mount Sinai and they're hearing this for the first time, the kinds of sacrifices that they're being taught about, the kinds of things that they're going to be sacrificing to God are represented in this list fairly well. There's not a lot of other kinds of animals that were sacrificed. So Abram brought all these things to him. He cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite of each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. So here's ancient, strange custom number 2. He's cut the animals in half, except for the birds, and he's laid them out. If you can imagine, we've got a half over here and a half over here with a pathway that goes in between. The custom was that the two individuals who were entering into a contract with each other, or to a covenant with each other, would lay the animals out, and then they would walk between the carcasses of the animals. And as far as we can understand, the point of the exercise was to say, if you renege on this contract, you'll end up like those guys, right? So it was a kind of the equivalent of the old saying, the Lord do so to me and more, or the Lord do so to you and more if you don't do X, right? So it's a threatening kind of thing. But at the same time, it was a very binding contract. Right? When two men did this together, it would make sense that they were serious about whatever it was that they were going to do. And in the life of Abraham, we go from this, which is kind of a catastrophic event, with dead bodies laid out and you're walking between all these carcasses, all the way to when he makes a contract to buy the cave of Machpelah so he can bury Sarah there. Do you remember how that contract takes place? The guy takes off his shoe and gives it to Abraham as a sign of the contract. If it's me, I kind of like to take off your shoe. That kind of contract is much less ominous than what Abraham is told to do here. So he gets them all laid out, and he has to hang around for several hours, evidently, guarding the carcasses against the vultures. So as the birds of prey come down, Abram's job is to drive them away. So back to verse 12. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep. A thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So God gives him kind of an advanced history lesson. We all know why, right? Joseph goes into Egypt. He calls for the rest of his brothers. They eventually settle in the land of Goshen. They live there for hundreds of years. Pharaoh turns against them, turns them into slaves, and eventually Moses brings them out and brings them to Mount Sinai. So if you're one of that bunch at Mount Sinai, you're getting some idea about how long this has been in the works, right? Father Abraham was told years ago, hundreds of years ago, that we would end up being slaves in Egypt, and he knew hundreds of years ago that God was going to bring us out and give us the land where Abraham was living. So all of that is good news for the people that have come up out of Egypt. But back to the strange ceremony that God has called Abraham into. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, and he said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." Basically, all the land of Canaan was to be Abraham and his descendants. So again, if you are an Israelite that's come up out of Egypt, you've just been told that by God's decree you have inherited all of this land where you're going. It belongs to you. It does not belong to all of these people because God's going to give it to you. He promised Abraham that he would, and he did so in this ancient ceremony where a torch and a flaming pot passed between the carcasses. Did Abraham go between the carcasses? He did not. God, or at least a representative of God, goes between the carcasses to say, I am making this covenant with you. I'm promising you. And the idea is that the one who could actually do something about the situation makes the covenant. Did Abraham have any power at this point to bring to pass all the things that God was promising him? Well, nothing, right? He didn't have any kids. He and Sarah had been together for years and years. They couldn't have any children. And so everything that he could do to fix the problem had been tried. It's not going away. The problem's still there. But then God says, I'll do it for you. And he walks between the carcasses of these animals as a sign, a physical, visceral, human kind of sign to say to Abraham, I've got this covered and I promise that it's going to happen this way. Abraham will die and be dead for hundreds of years before that promise made walking between those carcasses is fulfilled. But go back to verse 6. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. So in the absence of being able to do anything about it, in the absence of having the power to see physically any of the outcome, he still believes God. He still trusts that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. I love the fact that God did something physical here. Now, there was some spiritual stuff going on, right? Abraham goes into a deep sleep. I think God kind of sets him up so that he's not going to walk through. He's in place. He can't really join in the thing. His job was to keep the area free of the birds until God did what God did and went through. But he was unable to do anything about the situation, but God made a covenant with Abram. A couple of quick questions. Was Abram at this point in time circumcised? Not yet, right? So far, he's not even, the sign of the covenant that God makes with Abraham will eventually be that circumcision. He's not even circumcised yet. That doesn't happen until his son is born. Let's see. His first son, Ishmael, is 13. Abraham is 99. And Isaac is the first one under that covenant to be born and circumcised on the 8th day. So he's done zero to enter into the covenant, but God still says, this is the covenant I'm making with you, and I'm going to honor that covenant, and he does exactly what he said that he would do. There's the discussion, the description of how huge the area would be that Abraham inherits, I think as close as we get to a description in the Old Testament is when Solomon was king. This would be about 850, 860 BC. And it says that there was peace in the land, and Solomon reigned over the land from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is way up in the north of where Jesus lived. Beersheba is way down in the south, almost to Egypt. So a huge land mass that was all Israelite, all the nation of Israel at that point, from the Jordan River, a little east of the Jordan, all the way over to the Mediterranean, and from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. So very large, is probably as big as that nation has ever controlled all at one time. Anyway, I was telling Becky this afternoon, I find this lesson just fascinating. There were so many things that were human and cultural that Abraham and Sarah came up with, well, maybe we'll try this. And God says, no. But then when God wants to really make sure that Abraham understands that he's going to do what he said he would do, then he brings out this very physical, visceral, grotesque, by our imagination, kind of ceremony, so Abraham would know that God was absolutely serious about the things he was telling him. So put all that stuff in the back of your mind, and Lord willing, next week we'll talk about Sarah's idea of bringing Hagar into the equation. But if you need to respond tonight, maybe we can encourage you by way of a public response as we stand and sing.